It's a good day. It's a Thursday, which means that for a lot of you out there, you have one more day until the weekend. For those of you who do not have a weekend on Saturday or Sunday, then I guess technically I don't have a weekend on Saturday either. Oops, I am working, but I'm working on a different project, an exciting project, but one that will still be a considerable amount of work to do. Got to say hi to Avatar of Cain Requiem Lost, Elizabeth A. Neal, Written as Wrote, Ellie Spot, NFL. So if you haven't been keeping track of NFL's Twitter, you probably should. There's some gorgeous D10s coming out of that, which are going to be kickstarted soon, and that is exciting as hell. Because we don't get D10 sets. We don't get nice D10 sets. We get polyhedral sets. People make D20s, D10s, D12s, D8s, D6s, and D4s and sell those. But heaven help you if you want to find 10D10 that are baller. And if you do want to find them, then I'd suggest checking out that Kickstarter when it happens. We're watching it with great interest to see what will be in store. But the preview images that are on that Twitter account are pretty amazing, so I would have a look at that. Hey, Multiple Man Army. Today we are going to have just a regular old clinic hours, talking about RPGs, your questions, your comments, your rants, alongside the opinions of somebody who you probably should not be listening to. Hey, Dio. It's good to see you as well. I'm kind of starting this because of an essay, if we want to agree with the term essay, that was left on our Discord by Ellie Spot, and I'm gonna throw it up on screen because I think it's worth taking a look at, because it sort of led in from 2 weeks ago and 3 weeks ago. We were doing streams about relationships and sex, clinic hours after dark, and the interesting topics that kind of came up, there was something very specific that kind of like reached out and grabbed me. So if you get a grade after, all right, well, we can grade you if you need to. But let's have a look at it, because I think that it's got a lot of interesting things to say. So this is originally from Ellie Spot. Oh, okay, we're going to have to divide it up. It's a little too long. That's okay. We can do that. We can absolutely do that. I'm not in trouble. You're in trouble. All right, let's fix that up. So let's start here. And throw it up there. I've been thinking some more about separating character from player when it comes to role-playing romance and sex. I realized how easy it is for me to separate the character I'm playing against from the other player isn't really as important as how much I trust that the player I'm playing against are separating themselves from the character. And then goes on to say, if I'll throw that up here. Whoops, no, that's the same one. There we go. Nope. Come on. It's great because it's actually like a great essay and I'm the one who's screwing it up. I'm the bonehead. Okay, here we go. I think this has a lot to do with how sure I am that the other player is honoring the magic circle, letting the game be a game, and keeping the feelings and actions we take in the game attached to the game. I feel pretty much the same thing about playing intense conflict with other characters. I dare to push further and put more intense feelings into my play if I know the other player separates themselves from their character. And then caps it all off by saying one more thing, which is I think the clincher for me. Of course, if I perceive the other player to be very different from their character, that doesn't mean that the player is separating themselves from the character. But I think I use it as a screening tool. a sort of proxy. If I perceive the other player as pretty close to their character, I will probably make more of an effort to talk out of character before engaging in strong emotional play, romantic or conflict related. There we go. So, first of all, I'll give you a solid A on that essay. But what I can tell you is that it made me think a lot about one of the things that I ask players not to do. And I realized that it was something that I probably should have dovetailed off our conversation of sex and relationships. But there's something that I do ask players not to do, which is when you are making a new character in role-playing, not as an exercise, but as a genuine, I am going to participate in a role-playing game with many other players or even just a small number of other players, I ask that people do not make themselves. And what does that mean? The idea of character distance isn't necessarily that you can only play something that you are not. I don't think that's possible. It also doesn't necessarily mean that you need to make as many choices as you feel you can to distance a character from yourself without losing that believability. But it does mean that you need to be able to create a character who is solidly not you. A character that is someone for you to role play with, as opposed to a character that just is going to act and react as you will. And the main reason why this is important, I thought, at the beginning, was that a role-playing game is meant to be a fictional, collaborative, constructive story, and that it is actually impossible for you to create yourself. You will always create an idealized version of yourself, and that's not necessarily idealized in terms of exalting yourself to a level that you don't deserve. It's you're going to create a character that is your thought of yourself and putting it on the page, and that creates a barrier to good play, which is the idea that if you are reacting as you think you would react, then bleed becomes a concern. Bleed doesn't necessarily even have to be a concern coming from you. It can be a concern from other players at the table. If you attempt something in a role-playing game and you fail, then that failure should feel good. It should feel like it's part of the story and encourages those moments of tension, that worry, that pit in your stomach, until eventually the story concludes. Oftentimes this will be a happy ending, a victory snatched from the jaws of defeat, but sometimes it is in fact a quote-unquote bad ending that ends up being the most satisfying for a story. And my original thought was, well, you don't want to experience those endings as yourself, because what happens when you realize that your character is coming up short, or you realize that other people are going to make comments about your character that are really just thinly veiled comments about you? I no longer think that this is the main reason. And the main reason why I don't think that it's a big reason is that is that very specific thing that Ellie Spot brought up. I won't feel comfortable role-playing to my boundaries, my fullest extent, if I believe that you are taking too much out of the roleplay. So we're in a way discussing bleed, but what we're actually doing is discussing how we can create characters that still incorporate elements of ourselves, still incorporate elements of ourselves that we want to explore, but without investing so much of ourselves into a character that we can't start creating a character that we will, or a character or a story that we can be proud of. Because it is absolutely true that if you've created a character that I suspect is just a proxy of you, then perhaps I won't want to insult your character the way that I should as a storyteller playing an NPC who's brash and carries a lot of swagger and bravado with him. Perhaps I won't attempt to romance your PC, realizing that any attempt at romancing would also be an attempt at trying to crack the code that is you. Or I'll be concerned about bleed coming from you. The idea that you are investing yourself into this character and that your character's successes and failures will overly affect you because of that. So, First thing that I would do, if you are creating a character using a system such as Dungeons and Dragons, where honestly, you're not making that many choices right off the bat, and you're not creating a full character, you're joining an archetype, you are joining a class with which you will improve. This becomes less of an issue because oftentimes a lot of the mechanical roles that you're going to make will distance you from yourself quite a bit. But if you are specifically looking at creating a character that uses a point buy system, such as the World of Darkness or other storyteller type games, then it starts getting a little bit hairier. When doing this, you can start thinking about, okay, well, if I look at this sheet, I have taken a first aid class. That's medicine 1. I have experience shooting my BB rifle back at my hometown. That's firearms 2. I joined the wrestling team in high school. That's pretty good. So that's at least worth athletics 3. And you start creating a version of yourself that isn't in fact designed to be replicated by a simulation. You're investing yourself in dots that do not accurately depict you because they can't. No role-playing game can. There is no mechanic that exists today that will give you an accurate, fun representation of yourself. It's not possible. Even the most crunchy of games, even the most simulation heavy of games are games. They are not intended to create a virtual world modeled exactly after what the experiences that you have are. So there is there's an issue that comes with that right off the bat. Because also typically when you are creating a character in these systems, you're creating a character that is supposed to be by far better than the norm, by far better than what a normal person should be. And it gets difficult then sometimes to, for some players I've seen who have attempted to recreate themselves, they're frustrated because they have too many dots and then they feel as if they themselves don't measure up to what they should. Or you'll get a situation where somebody will sink a ton of dots into their character sheet, be happy with it, and then come away with a self-inflated ego. It's strange to say. This is way more common, of course, among younger players. But then they come into game. When they bring themselves into game, there is an expectation of, well, I can do this. I can do this normally. Why is it that I cannot do this in this game? It's easy for me. The system sucks. It starts breeding a mistrust in the system itself. You could say, okay, well, if I'm using myself, I'm a professional fight choreographer. So I got to say, well, I got to have at least a few dots in melee and a few dots in performance. And then if I roll the dice and the dice come up failures, because it's a game and there needs to be a dramatic reason to fail, then I'm the one who actually suffers as a result. I'm the one who ends up in a situation where I feel like, well, why did I fail here? I've never failed to choreograph a show before. Some shows are better than others, sure, but I've never failed at it. And it creates that poor relationship between you and the system because you are seeing how much it's not real life because you are engaged in your own character. And if you are engaged in your own character, as it represents you in real life, you're going to fail more often than not. Believe it or not, in the course of your day, the number of times that you would actually have to make a roll like you would in a normal role-playing game, is 0 or close to it. It's just not that common for you to have so much pressure on you that you need a dramatic resolution to that outcome. When you get in your car and you drive somewhere, you don't need to roll drive. Most people don't get in accidents each day. If you are taking a dance class, sure, you may not necessarily be the best dancer now, but you're definitely not going to fall on your face every 4 seconds if you are at least somewhat practiced at it. ludonarrative dissonance. I mean, look, Kung Fu Fenders, I'm trying to do a stream that I can try to have people follow. Ludonarrative dissonance is actually a very advanced technique that you can use in order to enhance the story, but we're not going to get into that today. So that's just kind of like a minor reason. The big reason is that I don't want to deal with watching you have your feelings crushed or elevated because of your feeling in a game. And I think that it's also just more fun to be able to distance yourself, more fun for you to be able to interact with a game using a character from which you can learn more. And you will learn more by trying things that you are not. Not always. I'm not saying that you have to be all different, because we also learn about the traits that are inherent in ourselves when they are put into situations that we don't normally see. And one of the ways to do that is to make sure that your character isn't identical. If you want to, for instance, explore elements of your self-identity, perhaps your sexuality, your gender, that's not to say that then you have to change everything else about you as well. Sometimes it would be handy for you to have a look and change one or two traits about your character, and then have the rest of them act as sort of a control to figure out, how does making one or two changes change things overall? How does it inform me about the things that I am, and how does it inform me about the things that I'm not, and moving on from that in a loose sense. The idea of a character becoming a way for you to learn more about yourself is also important, in that we're not just pulling you. We're creating a barrier between you and your character so that you can learn and experience without turning games into therapy. We don't want games into therapy. I might as well have just made this topic bleed. Anyway. Let's see. Multiple Man Army says, I realized I didn't look at those things the same when I was trying to get people to try the End of the World games, which basically tell you to play yourself in your current location. I was super excited, and everyone I talked to acted like I was proposing a death cult. There's also a matter of agency. If I'm playing myself, I should feel like I have agency over myself. There's very few people in the world who can claim that they have full and total agency over themselves. We don't. There are things in our lives that separate us and that cause issue. These can include things like laws, social norms, the needs of the body, right? I don't have agency over all of my actions. Every once in a while I get hungry. Sometimes I get tired. I'll get sick, and these things matter. If I'm injured, I lose agency because I can't just ignore the injury. I am bound by the body that I have with all of its strengths and weaknesses. But in general, I have agency over myself and my decisions. If I'm in a role-playing game, suddenly I've surrendered a lot of that agency. And for good reason. It's fun to surrender agency because it means that everyone else gets to contribute towards your story in a more direct fashion. But that doesn't necessarily feel good if you're playing yourself, because then you lose agency over what you would do in a certain situation. If the mechanics then say, you are frightened, and you say, but I don't think I would be frightened in this situation, that can be rough. It also means that you are falling prey to the idea that you cannot live up to the idealized version of yourself, like mentioned before. I can't count how many times that I've asked somebody who's created this, because this used to be a very common thing. Back when a lot of these games were more in their infancy and people were creating these, I'd see a lot of people say, well, just for fun, I'm going to try to make it myself. And then they'd say, oh yeah, I have willpower 7 out of 10. And in the books, the average human has a willpower of 2. So why do you think you have willpower 7? It's that idealized version of yourself. The idea that you think, okay, I'm pretty tough. I don't let people walk all over me. And they're wrong. Or they call out one example in the book, such as in the listings for strength, if it says you can lift 150 pounds, and someone says, well, I can lift 150 pounds, and they smack themselves down for strength 3. Well, There's a difference between lifting 150 pounds, deadlifting 150 pounds, bench pressing 150 pounds, or carrying 150 pounds. So there's that as well. But then you look at strength and you can say, well, I've got puny arms because I don't use them that much, but I got big muscular legs because I bike every day. And suddenly strength starts not working out well. Again, the crack, the ludonarrative dissonance appears and the system falls apart. So I don't want to tell my buddy that they're not calling for app 3. That I can tell a lot of people with sincerity. I find that it's actually pretty easy to say, you know what, appearance as a stat is just dumb anyway, because it is. I am looking forward to a time when appearance is no longer a stat. The favorite thing that I liked was when appearance became a merit, that it was something that you could buy at character creation, or perhaps even later on if you went through a transformation sequence or whatever. But I don't like appearance as an attribute partially because it's it's subjective. Not as subjective as I think we'd like it to be, but it is subjective. Then there's also the idea of, well, my appearance should matter, except it's difficult for a lot of storytellers to adjudicate appearance in that way, or for players to adjudicate appearance in that way. And then finally, there's just this concept of, well, when is it important and when should I roll? Because your appearance is it as important as your charisma or your manipulation? In the real world, yes, it absolutely is. But we don't like to think that way in a role-playing game. So we have that a lot. One of the things that I will mention is that in the Changeling game that I'm running right now over on Discord alongside the other RPGClinic people, is that there have been consistent reports of people calling out characters as incredibly attractive, and then pointing to their appearance ratings. And that's an interesting thing that people are doing, but it doesn't tell the whole story. The interpretation of an appearance rating is often how you describe the character and how they move, how they act, how they feel. One character will feel more attractive than another, and it isn't based on the number that you've written down on the sheet. I don't describe characters as ridiculously attractive if they shouldn't be, but I also recognize that the idea of appearance and adjudicating it in game can be pretty difficult for people who aren't used to it, because descriptions like that also involve a lot of artistic license. If I describe somebody whose appearance 7 out of 5, 5 is the human maximum and their appearance 7, and I make the claim that they have ways that they bend and shift the light around them as if the entire world is moving to their whim, then that seems like a really evocative statement. But players aren't as often able to bring that to the fore because it feels like they're making changes that they shouldn't to the world. It's a lot easier for storyteller characters to do. So it's, just thoughts on a Thursday. Requiem Lost says, I have a love-hate relationship with appearance. I like the idea of it being your ability at making first impressions or how you carry yourself. As for being incredibly attractive, it just doesn't work for me since people have different definitions of what is attractive. So I think that it's more that people have different definitions of what they find unattractive. It is because this is a simulation, and because buying into a simulation requires a shared kind of common ground in language, I think that this is less of an issue because I can point to someone and say, is this person attractive? And most people will agree. Even if there's like, I'm not personally sexually attracted to this person, or I'm not personally romantically attracted to this person, it can be pretty obvious the difference between somebody who has appearance 5 and somebody who has appearance 2. But a lot of their appearance is not based on genetics. Some of it absolutely is, but a lot of appearance actually comes through in fashion, in decisions. How much time does your character take to get ready in the morning? How much time does your character put into their clothing choices, makeup, hair, the way that they walk, the way that they talk, their posture? The way that you sound has a huge effect on appearance. the way that you carry yourself and your body has a huge effect on appearance, which is why you can't just also show a photograph and expect that to be enough. It won't be. But if I point out a particular actor, for instance, that people recognize and ask, is this person more attractive than, and I point to a photo of myself, you are going to get 99% of the people who are looking at this will say that the glamour model, the actor, the famous Hollywood actor or Bollywood or West End or whatever, compared to me. And I'm not saying that because I'm trying to like win sympathy or get like those, like put myself down and hope that the chat raises me up at this point. It's just a fact that humanity has developed beauty standards that have been reinforced by media and art and, just also the straight up genetic attractions that we carry for each other and put that forward. So there is that to keep in mind as well. Nollywood. Sorry, my water tastes especially good today. Multiple Man Army says appearance should be replaced with impression. That way, a beautiful person makes a good impression, but a kind-looking, friendly character, while not being beautiful, can still make people have a positive first impression. Maybe. But there have also been scientific studies that say that somebody's looks absolutely influence the way that society treats them. For example, economists have studied tipping and have found that women receive more tips than men, and conventionally attractive women receive more tips than women who do not fall into those categories, regardless of service. Most people claim that they tip based on service, but they don't. They actually tip based on appearance or attraction levels to somebody. And often if you are dealing in a short transaction like in a restaurant, you're not seeing this person for very long. So I'd be a great Lex Luthor? Nah. I don't know. The bestest Nosferatu in a live action movie? Oh, boy. Vampire. The appearance actually does matter. It makes a difference in society, but also we're in a role-playing game. Do we want it to? So, yeah. So Multiple Man Army actually, calls me out, which I think is fair. I don't know if I necessarily agree, but it is absolutely fair to call me out on this. We're not modeling the real world, like you said, so let's not be a jerk and pin everyone's first thought on looks. Yeah, in a way, yeah. Because the other thing is that other social attributes kind of take into account things that we would put under appearance anyway. Your charisma, some of your charisma absolutely has to do with how you look and how you carry yourself. There's a big difference between hearing somebody talk the way that I'm talking to you right now, but I could also, I could change my posture. I could throw my shoulders back. I can lift my body up so that I can project my voice better. I can do voice exercises for the next 20 minutes so that my voice becomes much smoother without the same sort of roughness of quality or the occasional crack. And that will be part of my appearance, but it'll also be part of my charisma. But then you can get into people's dialects and accents, and the idea that your dialect or accent can actually make a big difference as to whether people pay attention to you or not, either in general or if they're locals. So the reality is that simulations just suck, and we have to deal with that by coming up with ways to deal with being in a simulation, which is why you shouldn't model on real people or try to model too closely to reality, because you can't. You absolutely can't. I can do prosthetics. That is true. And you think that impression could wrap up more as a blanket term than appearance. But then my argument would be that impression as a stat, is it a stat that's worth modeling on? Because the issue with all ideas in design is the complexity worth the trade-off in terms of time it takes to learn, time it takes to process, and time it takes for somebody to internalize those lessons. if I say impression and I detail it, and everyone around me is like, yeah, that's fantastic, fantastic. But what happens when I run an adventure where you only meet new people every once in a blue moon? Everybody who invested in impression goes down. But that's also the same of every other stat, especially appearance. So, these are things that we have to work out for ourselves. But I think impression is an interesting way to put it. I think that as a stat is quite clear. It's also one of those things where a lot of games try to base themselves on the D&D 6, strength, dexterity, intelligence, wisdom, constitution, charisma. And even if they don't necessarily give them the same names, they might say things like force, finesse, likability, common sense, book smarts, and, conditioning, but it's still the same thing. Impression interests me as a concept because it's at least, it isn't just a straight up copy of appearance. But first impressions, I feel like, aren't your first impressions also sort of balanced by your charisma? People don't necessarily get a great first impression of you if you don't have a charismatic bone in your body. But that means that I could jack my impression up to the max and jack my charisma down to nothing, in which case everybody likes me when they meet me, but then within 2 minutes, everybody hates me. And as interesting as an idea that might be, that's not necessarily the simulation that I'd be looking for. So these are just balances. You'd be surprised how well, no, maybe you wouldn't be. You've heard me yell about it many, many times, but elegant designs are sometimes very difficult, even if they seem at first to be pretty obvious. Everybody's got an edge case. Maybe a reputation stat block might sit well next to personal intimacies. Reputation is a thing that you'll see in some games, either as a resource that you can spend or as an indicator of health, your reputation with certain groups. You'll see this a lot in video games, especially games like Grand Theft Auto or Red Dead Redemption, open world sandbox type games, where you should be keeping track of which choices you make as a character affect how people like you or dislike you. But Requiem. This is interesting. I think White Wolf had the problem that physicals and mentals had 3 attributes each, so they had to come up with a third for social, so appearance. But they changed that in what they called the New World of Darkness, which are now known as the Chronicles of Darkness, a line that they've essentially abandoned and moved on to Onyx Path, is the idea of the mentals, physicals, and socials having a force, finesse, and fortitude. So you have strength, dexterity, and stamina under your physicals. Under your mentals, you have intelligence as your force, wits as your finesse, and then you have resolve instead of perception. And resolve being your ability to resist mentally. And then socials, you have charisma, manipulation, and composure. The idea that there is a charisma is like the force of your personality, manipulation is your ability to dipsy doodle around things, and composure is your ability to resist socials on you. And I really liked that as a concept as well. You asked Mark Reinhagen about it at a point. I probably butchered the pronunciation of his name. But that's cool. Kung Fu Fenders knows people. Knows more people than I do. Knows way more people than I do. Yeah, composure and resolve is in V5. They brought that back. And it's a fun way of building up willpower. So I have weird thoughts about willpower, especially recently because of Exalted Essence. He still owes me $8 for barbecue. You owe him for years upon years of wonderful roleplay experience. Mage 5 does seem like it's 3 games away. We're definitely getting Hunters next. I imagine that we'll be getting Werewolf 5th after Hunters, and then probably Mage. I'm not convinced we'll get a Changeling 5th edition, but we might. I'm kind of hoping we do, because I'd be curious to see what they're going to do with it, but we'll see. Not with that attitude. Well, Yeah, I have a feeling like Mage is a little bit away. Mage is an incredibly difficult game to design. M20 doing so, I'll probably push back Mage 5. Possibly. Yeah, I know that there are people who want to do Changing the Dreaming Fifth. It's one of those game lines that evokes a lot of loyalty. It is less popular than the other main three, but it is, of the people who do play it, they're fiercely loyal to Changeling. And so you'll find people will still pay very much attention to those books as they can. Mage is incredibly difficult to design, though, because it's got such its magic system is just a fucking nightmare. It is a goddamn nightmare. It is the opposite of elegant design. It is interesting design, but it is definitely not streamlined. So there's that as well. Kung Fu Fenris, man, you should just like do stories of my interactions with the game design world, and I think everybody would tune in. They would just want to listen to you. Fiercely loyal can also mean mad fans if you don't do it properly. I mean, hell, have a look at the Netflix adaptation of Cowboy Bebop and how people are coming out about that. You run into a very strange situation where if you don't change enough, everyone hates you because they figure, well, why did you, like, they'll compare you directly to the old thing and have nostalgia for the old thing. If you change too much, people will hate you because now it no longer feels like the old thing that they know and love. So you have to find that fine line, that adaptation line. And for people who really, really love Changeling, the problem is that a lot of people can point to the things that they know are broken and say, I know that this is a bad rule. This is stupid, but everybody's going to disagree on how to fix it. So, yeah. Mage Magic is sandboxy as heck and the epitome of find the right table or it's a nightmare. Yeah, it is. It is a fascinating thing, right? And for players who really enjoy trying to figure out that crunch, it can be a fantastic, phenomenal experience. I was enough of a masochist that I ran a Mage LARP, co-ran a Mage LARP for years. And that was in a LARP situation. And we had people who had to be able to come up with effects on their own in the middle of a LARP session, get them validated during play, and then trying to go off, which was great because I had a hermetic mage just shout "Forces 3" and then thrust his hand forward and said, well, that should be enough. And we said, do you literally say the word "Forces 3"? And he was like, no, I don't. But then had no way to deal with his paradigm, and then he quit the game. So there's a lot of that. Playing M20 needs 4 books. How do I do that? You know that you've got an interesting product when they have to release a source book that says, okay, we know our magic system is very complicated. Here's some examples of ways that you can incorporate it into your system. And people read that book and half the people just disagree with the game designers on how it works. It is a fun time for all. But yeah, I think that they definitely want to try Mage. I think that Mage the Awakening versus Mage the Ascension. Awakening was the New World of Darkness, and Ascension was the classic. I despised Mage the Awakening, but that's me because it kind of touched upon like eldritch horror and the idea of eldritch gods, and it was like, not only was it so far from Mage the Ascension that I felt like they were different games, I was like, I don't like eldritch horror anyway. I don't find it compelling or interesting. So I found it boring, and it looks like Kung Fu Fenris felt the same way. But they have to figure it out. They'll have to try because Mage is definitely popular, and they'll give it a shot. At least Bud has a question, and I like questions. A question on the first subject. If you find yourself playing against someone who has very little separation from their character, how can you approach them and communicate about it? So, a difficult question. And part of the reason why it's difficult is that my first reaction as a storyteller is that if I see this happening, it often involves some quite direct intervention to the point where I would say, as much as I'd like to say, the first thing I do is walk up to this person and say, you need to make a new character right away. It's not easy to do that. Quite recently, in fact, I have learned that it is very much not easy to do that. It is tough to tell people no. People don't like to tell people no. People like to be liked. They like to get along. They have this sort of feeling that they want to be liked, and so therefore they don't want to disappoint anyone. But if I find somebody who has very little separation from their character, in general, I know that around the corner I will find problems with the game. It's almost inevitable. There are people out there who also deny that they're playing versions of themselves, and that makes it worse, because typically that means that what they're trying to do is they're trying to work through things. They're trying either therapy or replacement. And therapy is like, their role-playing therapy is a thing, but most tables are not where it should happen. And replacement, the idea of I can't have something, so instead I'm going to put it in this game and then treat it as if I actually have this thing in my real life, which is one of the more extreme versions of bleed. That's something that you'll find with people who have very little separation from themselves and their characters. So in general, the first thing that I would do is approach them and say, I have concerns that your character is, there are issues, without even necessarily saying, I think that you're too close to your character. I would be pointing at the issues that I'm noticing with the character in the game itself, which generally means either you need to create a new character and start fresh, wipe the slate clean, or this is not the game for you. At a tabletop, this can be very difficult to do, because sometimes by the time that you figured out that there's a problem, it's too late to be able to effortlessly change characters out. And players can get angry when you tell them that they can't continue a story that they want to continue. But it is quite a pickle. Ellie Spot goes on to make more precise. How do you make them aware of what the problem can be without saying, hey, you think your character is you, and they feel insulted? I wouldn't actually bring it up with them, which I know sounds dishonest, and it kind of goes against use your word hole. But sometimes it's a kindness to lie about this kind of thing. If I suspected, for instance, that you were playing yourself in a game and I was uncomfortable about it, coming right out and saying, you're playing yourself and that makes me feel uncomfortable, is, for some people, that would be the equivalent of my walking forward, cracking them across the face and saying you're a bad role player. And for some, it would be the implication of everything that you are doing wrong. The reason why I'm upset is because I don't like you. And neither of those things are necessarily true, but sometimes they absolutely are true. And those are truths that we don't necessarily want to hear, especially not from people who we may not know very well. We don't always role play with people who we're extremely close with. So it's a situation in which I would say, oh man, hell, maybe I'll just change the topic at this point. The idea of lying and when it's appropriate in a role-playing context. This is a situation where I would lie by omission. If I needed to be obvious about something, I would say, these are the individual things that I'm noticing that are making me uncomfortable, and I wouldn't try to lead towards because you are playing yourself. It's kind of tricky. It's tricky in the way that, I mean, we were talking about sex and role playing earlier. It's tricky in the way that if I suspected that somebody was trying to engage in sexual role play because they were using it as a proxy for something that they themselves desired sexually. For instance, if somebody was attempting to play a character who had a particular sexual fetish that you yourself could not satisfy in your real life. And if I was worried about that, if I was worried and saying things such as like, hey, so it kind of feels like you're trying to get your jollies off on me, I don't like this, that could be a problem. So that's a question that we have to look forward to answering at some point. Let's not. So instead I would just say, your depiction of sex is making me uncomfortable. I would not go so forward as saying, your depiction of sex makes me feel like you are trying to have sex with me by proxy, and I'm not responsible or desire to be a part of your sex life. So that is the issue. Now, so this is actually something fascinating, because this is kind of, it goes along in parallel. Kung Fu Frienders mentions, we had a weird talk at this year's KP with people discovering weird kinks through LARPs and how to deal with it mid-event. You do discover things in role-playing. You absolutely do. And some of those things may be of a private nature, like sex. The trick is to not involve somebody who does not wish to be involved in your private life. The shoe salesman analogy fits this time. This is something that's borrowed from Dan Savage. The idea that a foot fetishist can work as a shoe salesman if that person goes in every day, treats customers with respect, and if that person goes home at the end of the day without telling anybody and decides to engage in remembering his workday while gratifying himself, he's not actually hurting anybody. And it's inappropriate of us to try to police people to that point, to say, well, if you're a foot fetishist, you should never look at feet again. Doesn't make sense. But what would be a problem is if that person served a customer, found them shoes, and then told them, I'm going to go home tonight and I'm going to jerk off to the idea of your feet. Then you're involving them in your sex life. You are pulling them in. You're directly involving them. And in much the same way in a role-playing context, if you find something that you absolutely find incredibly attractive, that's actually okay. If you find that you're role-playing and you are getting gratification from it, that's fine, as long as you can keep that separate from everything else. And for a lot of people, this is impossible, which is why it's not something that I necessarily would recommend to people. You can't control somebody's sexuality that way and say you're not allowed to get off on your day-to-day, but you absolutely can say, but you can't make me part of it, because that's where I've got an issue that derives from that. Not everybody role plays sex for sexual gratification. I don't. But there are people who absolutely will. That's just the way it is. You can't stop it, but you absolutely can insist that they don't involve you. So in that way, it's also really tough, coming back to the first topic, that if your character is engaged in a sexual relationship with somebody who doesn't feel very different from that person, then it starts feeling like you are engaged in a sexual relationship with that person. You're now involving them in your sex life. So that's kind of where it goes. It's difficult to say these kinds of things sometimes without sort of automatically sounding like I'm perverted. It's whoa, but there are Canadian researchers these days. We're all adults. Yeah, but adults don't necessarily like the idea of talking about this. I'll also point out that of the people who are watching in chat, or the people who watch our streams on Sundays, have seen me roleplay relationships with many different characters across many different people. And then if I come out and say, there are people out there who do this, then it's almost like me admitting that I do these things myself. So there's that. You take your words from me that I'm not. Well, I think I can also have one defense, which is that if I was trying to role play in a sexual context, then I must have an incredibly wide spectrum of sexual desires, because I have played many different characters on this stream alone. It's not possible for me to be into all of those things. Trust me. And also, if I was doing that for sexual gratification, I probably would have done it way earlier on, instead of just like waiting until now to start bringing it up. It's secretly been my desire to watch my two of my players get involved and then also worm my way into a threesome with them. Like, no. Hey, Benny Keys. Looking like a condom. Cool. Adult by age, not of mind. I mean, like, I am definitely not an adult. I wish. But I am just a foolish, foolish person. Now that we've kind of got that along, so I would absolutely lie about things. Hey, Benny Keys. So just in case you don't know, it's kind of weird to come into a stream and just immediately start commenting on the streamer's appearance. So please don't. I appreciate it. I appreciate compliments just like anybody else, but it's still a little strange. So at any rate, now for whatever that's worth, we can also discuss about the ideas of if you are encountering the situation and the person's not getting the hint, what do you do? Yeah, I don't know, Benny Keys. You're not really making a great case for yourself here. I think you're gone. I'm just not dealing with it today. At any rate, sorry about that. But like, that's actually an example. I appreciate that, Kung Fu Fenders. I'm sorry that I hopped the trigger on that, but it's kind of one of the issues when it comes to safety in role-playing games, and especially with the sort of situation we're describing at the beginning of the stream about somebody who's playing too close to themselves, is that we also try sometimes to think of the people. We try to think the best of people's intentions, and we try to make excuses for people. And that's kind of the issue that we run into. I wanted to believe that this person, when they followed, were following because they legitimately had some things to contribute to the conversation, or that they just liked what they were seeing and wanted to come back. That would have been great. They make the first comment looking like a condom, and I'm like, interesting. Not sure what that means. But like in the pit of my stomach, I knew that this was somebody who was going to be trouble, and that I could have just banned them right then and there. But I didn't, because I wanted to see if there was going to be like a second chance or a third chance. But instead, after the first comment, I made it clear, I don't know if I'm liking this comment. The second comment comes out, I very specifically say, I do not like this kind of commentary from somebody who I don't know. And then the third comment came out, and I just realized that nothing was going to get better, so I pulled the trigger. But you see how that's kind of like, I gave this person 2 chances before the third, somebody who I owe nothing to at all. And you'll find that oftentimes where you run into issues with players who are doing things that are disrupting your game, and you can't pull that trigger right away because you want to believe that things can get better. In large scale LARPs, I'm talking like the big LARPs that you've seen. Quebec, we have a bunch. Bicodien is a huge one. Kung Fu Fenders can tell you tons about LARPing over across the pond. So can Ellie Spot. So can plenty of other people, I'm absolutely sure. And one of the things about large scale LARPs is that you kind of have to pull the trigger really early, or you don't get things done. When you see that people are having an issue, having a safety issue, the more that you start playing okay, well, let's find out what everybody says, and now that everybody knows, we'll see if we can do it. As soon as somebody says, I can't with this person, in a large scale LARP, you have to pull the trigger. Otherwise you can severely jeopardize the people who you're around. Discovering one bad apple among 200 people is really difficult. It is. Because the other thing is that if a lot of people are strangers and one person says, I don't like this, and another person says, that's not what was happening, who do you believe? And the idea of believing victims by default is one way of going about it, which is critical. But then there's that gut reaction of, well, what happens if somebody tries to use that offensively? Or what if somebody came into a game ill-equipped or ill-prepared and then immediately says, I don't feel safe, even though that's kind of their fault? There's a big difference between I don't feel safe because a player's being a creep to I don't feel safe because I actually am really uncomfortable at the sight of blood and I joined a post-apocalyptic vampire LARP where everybody is covered in blood. You know, like it's difficult. It's part of the reason why we have safety cards. But the safety cards that we use, hold on. Always within reach. The idea of safety cards is also tough because this is still the hardest card to use. It's still really tough to use this card properly. I don't necessarily use it properly. We've never had a red card pulled, for instance, in RPGClinic. We've never have. We have had yellows, and yellows for varying levels of reasons. Either yellows being like, are we sure that everybody understands what's going on? To yellows of, hey, I'm reaching my limit. I'm kind of not okay. But the idea of just straight up saying I'm not all right is tough. And we saw it right there with the conversation that we ended up removing the ban that we sent out. I wasn't comfortable right from the start, which is why I basically pulled one of these and I said exactly how I felt. I did it twice and then gone because I'm learning as I'm using these cards. I'm learning about what I can do with them, what's important, how to handle. And LA Spot takes a very correct track. Some players will tell you, but it's muddled by other situations of she said, he said. You can't always kick people at the first signal. And very specifically, it's a lot more emotional work for organizers than to boot people on Twitch. I can boot somebody on Twitch, and the main question that I have if I boot somebody who I've never met before on Twitch is this person then going to start deciding to become a problem for me, to then mount issues against the channel, to organize hate raids, or to bot me or to dox me? Those are the things that I have to deal with on Twitch, but the chances of those are relatively low, the press notwithstanding, for at least a quite small time streamer like myself. So I don't necessarily have to worry about that as much, but if you're dealing with someone face to face, it's another story. It's another ball game entirely. Or if you're dealing with somebody, you know, but that's, I mean, in the end, it kind of, does it always come back to safety cards? It all kind of comes back to the green card, right? The green card is our training card. But it is originally, that was the design. The design was the green card is there so that we can unequivocally state that we're okay. But it was also the idea being, yeah, but if you get used to using the green card, then it might make you more likely to pull for another card at the same time. And then we've realized that the green card is in fact probably the most important card in the set. It sounds weird, but it is the one that is the most used, and it is the one that has the most value, because if I flash a green card, I am not only saying, hey, I'm cool with this, and everybody can know that, but I think something that we're going to have to add into the design somewhere, either with the instructions that will come with the cards themselves or the website that will accompany them, or the video that I really want to try to make to detail these cards, is that if you can't show a green card, that's usually a sign that you should be showing one of these. So if you get people used to the idea of like, yeah, I'm good, I'm good, I'm good, I'm good, and then the moment where you're like, but I'm not good anymore, that's when it's time to start pulling these out. And that's kind of where we're at with the cards in a way. And it's something that I'm kind of hoping that we can continue to develop. But yeah, it turns out the green cards are actually the most useful. What? Not what I would have thought. People think that the emergency stop button is incredibly important, but the emergency stop button is really hard for people to pull. We've seen it time and time again. We are still not necessarily good at it. The last time that I pulled a red card, the last time I pulled a red card specifically for myself, I agonized over it. And like, I shouldn't. I should feel absolutely ready to just pull a red card and say, I'm not okay. We got to deal with this. And I didn't want to, but I realized that I needed to. So, Ellie Spot says, I feel like relying on that players will flash red cards if they need to is a false sense of security. Freeze reactions is a real thing, and it will prevent people from pulling red cards. The red card should still be there, but you can't expect people to use it. And that is true. And that is something that we have absolutely been picking up on as we've been going through. The idea of, hey, you've got an X card, right? The X card is there. You can use it. If the X card is the only card on the table, it feels like an admission of guilt or calling somebody out, an accusation. And that's not the sensations that people like to have. The yellow card being just hey, I need you to listen is a nice way of kind of countering into that, which is why we have 3 levels. Originally I thought like 3 levels might be too much. It might be difficult for us to kind of maintain, because, I have to carry 3 cards instead of 1. And now I realize that the green card is just the easiest, because if I see somebody show a green card and then other players look like they become uncomfortable or they can't show a green card themselves, then that's a sign. Also, right away, the absence of consent is not consent. It's no. I ask you if you like if you like the way that I'm touching you, and if your answer is, then the answer is no, right? And then I should immediately stop touching you. It's the same with role playing in a lot of ways. Which means that green card is the consent. It's the enthusiastic yes. And without the enthusiastic yes, we know that there's a problem. Requiem Lost says, the safety cards are a bit of a process. I will admit that in Disconcordia, there have been a couple of times where I was like, I don't know. It was hard to pull a yellow card, and once or twice I didn't for similar reasons. I didn't want to disrupt the game or call people out. It's a process. It absolutely is. It absolutely is. Which is why we've been more likely to use the cards ourselves as storytellers, because we want to get people used to them. It's just tough. It's tough, and this is not a full solution. We're still working on these designs. As easy as it is to say, okay, well, what's the yellow card? If I hold up a yellow card, it means everyone stops and listens to me, and then I put it down. That's not enough. We're trying to make the design as clear and concise as possible, because we also don't want to say, hey, do you want to use these cards? Watch this 2-hour tutorial on what we do with them. That's also not going to work, because no one's going to bother. Tools have to be easy to use, easy to understand, and effective. And those 3 things are not always aligned. Ellie Spot throws out there, I think it's good practice using yellow cards for things like, hey, can we clear this rule thing up too to lower the threshold? Then there's a bigger chance someone will at least use the yellow card when they should be using the red one. Yeah, and we have seen that. We've seen it happen a few times where I see yellows and I think they should probably be reds. And I have now got into the habit myself. I mean, again, this is all learning, right? And learning is useful. Is that if I see someone pull a yellow and I suspect it should be a red, I pull it myself. Even if I'm not the one in distress. Because I'd rather pull a red and be wrong than not and be wrong. If I am starting to suspect that somebody is in true distress, then I don't want the game to continue until we can work it out. Which is why if a player pulls a yellow and I suspect that it should be a red, then I can put a stop to it. Because what's the worst thing that can happen? Everyone says, no, everything's fine. But I also notice that if I've pulled a red card, typically someone comes forward and says, okay, yes, there is a problem and I need to work through it. And that's important. But lowering the threshold and being able to have somebody say, but yes, I have a yellow, can make a big difference, because a yellow is at least a way for you to stop and have people stand up and say, okay, well, there's something that I need to point out here. We've even had people play green cards and then say, and I should also point out that all of these examples that I'm giving are not me saying that a player did wrong. I'm saying it's me learning about how these cards are used and what's important. I've seen a few instances where somebody shows a green card and immediately says, I'm showing a green card except, or I'm showing a green card as long as. And those aren't situations for green cards. That's a situation for a yellow. If the idea is, yeah, no, I'm okay, I guess, you're not okay. And a yellow, even if the yellow is just as simple as like, look, I'm totally fine. I just kind of wish that you'd stop using this one word. Well, I would have rather that I learned that you don't want me to use that word. So I'm glad that you told me. But a green card is supposed to be, I'm good. I am enthusiastically consenting to what's happening. And I'd never want to see somebody show a green card and then have me to wonder whether it means yes or no. In much the same way that if I am seeking consent from somebody for any kind of activity, hell, I'm about to do stage combat, fine, we'll use that. If I'm seeking consent to say, may I touch you so that I can put your body in the correct position for this particular move, I don't want to hear them say, yes, that's absolutely fine. You can totally do that. No problem for me to do it. And then to find out 20 minutes later that that person absolutely didn't want me to touch them at all. So, yeah. So that's something that we're learning. A couple of lessons that we're learning about the safety cards. The green card absolutely means I am okay. And if there's ever any question about I'm okay but, or I'm okay if, then it is not a green card situation. That's a yellow. Or a red. It could absolutely be a red as well. Because the red card is also a way to sort of, if you show a yellow and you say something and then it isn't respected, then a red card kind of has to follow, right? And that's a football thing. Soccer thing for some of you. You can't get 2 yellows in a game. If you get a yellow card and then you get another yellow card, you actually get a red card and you're ejected. That's how the game goes. And that's kind of, if you have to show a yellow card twice for the same issue, that means that somebody has not understood you. I'm not going to say that means that that person is wrong or has done something incorrectly. It means that they didn't understand your original intent, which means you got to have a conversation about it. And it's not going to take 2 seconds. You need to put a stop to the game. So Elliespot says, but at least you used the cards and had meta communication. So the but was there. And that's absolutely true, which means that like they still did their job. The thing is that if green cards are being flashed, green cards are the only cards that can be flashed without any explanation. That's not the card I meant to show. I'll use my green screen version for it. Without cards, there may not have been a but at all. Correct. But the green cards are the cards that are designed to be shown without any need for any explanation at all. And I want to encourage players, if I come across a player who says, yes, but, then I want them to feel okay pulling a yellow card, because then it makes it easier for me to tell if they're doing all right or not. I don't want to guess if somebody flashes a green card whether they're okay or not. At that point, then I'm uncomfortable because it means that I'm not sure if you're okay. So that's kind of a trick. So we have to find a way to communicate that as well, but we have to find a way to communicate that, again, quickly and easily. Cards won't work if they are too hard to use, too hard to learn, or not effective. And we have to make sure they're all 3. And the wordings on those things are incredibly tough. Because one of the things that we found a lot in terms of our text work is that people are doing an awful lot of like green ? As a are you okay question. And I like that. I like the concept of that. I want to be able to bring it over into live play. But how do I do that? Is it okay enough to just sort of like look at a player and be like, are you all right? Like, instead of even saying anything, so I don't have to interrupt the rest of the game? Or do I need to be, are you okay? And get a very deliberate green card from it. So, questions. Everybody's been doing that, Kung Fu Fenders, and it's fantastic. I love it. I absolutely love it. But I think that in a way, it almost is like, I wonder whether one rule that I had decided at one point might be a good idea, and then I talked myself out of it, and I still had to figure it out, is if somebody shows a green card, it's a sign that everyone should show a green card. Someone is saying, I'm okay. Everybody has to immediately sort of follow up with an I'm okay so that we can move on. But then you kind of run out of the sort of situation of the gleeful green card, the like, I'm all good about everything. And like, I like that. I like the fact that the cards give a positive emotional response. The gift that EliSpot made of Liz just like flashing a card and showing it around to everybody is a great gift because it shows that there's happiness in using the cards. I want to encourage that, but I don't want to encourage somebody doing this and flashing around and then everybody having to stop and dig out their cards and show it and then leave. So you use the cards at 4 of your tables. Damn, Kung Fu Fenders. I vote you put a question mark on one side of the green card so you can flash it when you need to check. A thought that we had. The issue is if I flash this card at you, but somebody sees it from behind, it no longer works. Because we want these cards to be compatible with LARP play as well. And in a LARP, you can't guarantee that somebody's in front of you or behind you. And I don't want to say like, okay, well then you can palm the card like this so that you're not showing other people because then people behind you can't see the card at all. These are the issues of design. This is like the edge case of like, yeah, having a question mark, that would be great. Except it's sometimes not useful. Or what happens if I pick up the card and then I'm like, okay, yeah, I want to ask a question. So I hold up the card and I'm looking at the question mark because that's what I think. And now I'm just seeing that instead of showing the opposite side of the card because I'm not thinking about which side of the card I'm showing. So that's the issue. Incidentally, just because we don't always show the other sides of these cards are, they're card dividers. They're designed for collectible cards like Magic or, sports cards or whatever. So that's why they have the Ultimate Guard logo on the other side. And we've also labeled each ones of ours. And the reason we've done that, even though we technically could just check, does everybody have 3 cards sitting at the table? The reason we've done that is because I also like the idea that these cards, people have a sense of personal attachment to them. But yeah, lots of questions. We've had people make some great suggestions, and great suggestions may not always be the ones that we take. Like, that's a great suggestion, Requiem, the idea of like, can we have a card with a question mark? Great idea. I don't necessarily think we can make it work, but that doesn't mean the idea isn't extremely valuable because it may guide me to the answer. One of the secrets of design in, at least in the design that I do, is if you consider 90 things and you discard all of them, you might feel like you had a bad day, but you didn't. Now you have 90 things that you know don't work. Or even better, now you have 90 ideas that you've evaluated. So maybe one of them will come up again in the future and you'll realize that it does work. Or enough things have changed that now that idea that formerly didn't work now can. So. EliSpot says, I think in LARPs, facial expression would work better. Flashing green and giving someone a questioning look should work. Yeah, and I think that you can do that in tabletop play as well. The idea of just being like, no, fuck, wrong card. Like, okay? Like, even just the way that I am making eye contact with somebody, I'm just like, I'm not talking. I'm showing you a card and hoping that you'll respond with it. Maybe enough. But is it enough? And these are all things that we're trying to test and figure out ourselves, not just with us, but also the Discordia. So if you use the cards at your table, just let us know how you use them. I'm really curious if you have brought this system in particular to your table. And again, this system works for us. It may not work for you, and that's fine. There's no, like, have safety tools. I very strongly recommend that you use safety tools all the time, but you absolutely don't have to use ours if they're not the ones that your group works best with. Yeah, iteration is a super important process creatively when you have the time. That's kind of it, right? Like when you have the time, and maybe you don't. But if you do, it's a good thing to have. Requiem points out, and I think this is absolutely a good thing to point out, I think it's fair to say that not every safety system is perfect, and a lot depends on your group. For your group, for example, I notice you easily run those checks by the way you present the card. Yeah, it works for us, but I'll also point out that we literally go over the cards every damn session. Every time we play, we go over the cards. Now, some of that is for audience. If you're new and you don't know what the cards are, we want you to know. Some of it is public service, kind of, I guess. The idea that we're trying to educate as well as play. But I also think that it's important to just sort of acknowledge, like, hey, green means great, yellow means wait, red means stop, all of that sort of thing. So, I mean, you can find the information on our website. The site is not complete because we honestly don't need that much of a website all the time. But if you go to rpgclinic.com/safety, there is information on these cards alongside some extra tips and information that we put in about them. So you can always check that. You can always have a look. But we're just not making a big deal about it yet because we aren't ready for release. Despite the fact that we've been using these cards for over a year, over 2 years now, I think. We don't believe that they're ready yet, or at least I don't. And once we agree that we feel like we've got a good system down for it, then we'll see about releasing them. Because our plan is to be able to make these cards with instructions into packs that then can be sold. We're not intending to sell them for any profit. But the idea that either they'll be print on demand that you can just make your own, or the idea that you can order them from a card manufacturer and be able to use them at your own games, and we won't take a cut. So in other words, you'll be paying for the process, and that's it. We also have to figure out, maybe it would just be better for us to order 200 of them and then ship them ourselves. But shipping is a pain in the ass. It really is. But perhaps for our community, right? We're a relatively small community, and maybe it would work out for that at least. So we'll see. So I got distracted by safety card talk, which seems to be every other clinic hours, or every clinic hours at this point. Are there any questions that people want to throw out there? Any other topics or any other situations? Feel free to ask me the tough ones, ask me the easy ones, ask me the weird ones, and we can all talk about it together and feel uncomfortable or feel good about things. Yeah, NFL knows shipping's a pain. There's a reason why a lot of people who use crowdfunding also hire companies to do their fulfillment for them. Logistics are a nightmare. But, the idea of it can just literally be, hey, if you are part of our community, we'd probably only do it once. And then after that, we would say, okay, well, now if you're interested, you're going to have to find a way to get your own. But we'll see. Going to bed now, this is enlightening. Oh, I'm glad it was enlightening for you. That's always gratifying to hear. But of course, we're also streaming at a time when most North Americans are still at work, and most Europeans are thinking about why they aren't in bed already. This isn't necessarily like the best time slot, but it's the time slot we have and the time slot that works. And so therefore we will keep using it. And that works for us anyway. We shall see. Well, fun's a good way to look at it too. If it isn't fun, then I would argue that we're in trouble. You've got a little question. All right, let's have a look at this little question. First in-person session post-pandemic next week. Any tips for adjusting back? Okay, so first sessions after a while. I have to ask, have you been playing in your game remotely? Or have you paused the game and it's been a year and a half, 2 years since you've last played? Yes. I'm not sure which one you're answering, I'm afraid. So you have been playing remotely is what I'm going to assume. Playing remotely. Okay. So the first thing that you need to do is acknowledge that it's weird. Personally to yourself, but you can also acknowledge it to your friends or players or storyteller as well. Liz and Scott were remote during RPGClinic streams for a year or close to it. And that was, something that was different and difficult. We had experience with it for a long while we were running Exaltwitch and then later on Changeling the streaming. I wasn't even in the same country. I was tuning in remotely and the three of them would gather, and that was something that we kept doing and it was great. I'm glad that we did it. We were remote gaming before it was cool. No, don't mean to say that, but then I came back and it was fantastic. Like, we loved it. We slipped it on like old shoes and went forward, but that's not how it's always going to be. You kind of have to acknowledge at the beginning just that it's different. Even that, it might take you just 30 seconds, but doing that is a great way of kind of saying, okay, we've all acknowledged that a situation is not the situation that we are, or currently at least, used to. And that gives people permission then to open up about anything else that might be weird for the rest of the day. Giving people permission is one of the best things that you can do, because permission can either be permission to say when something isn't right or permission to say when something absolutely is. And that's kind of like the differentiator there. So when we first got back together after the pandemic, we made sure to sort of mention, like, this is great. I'm glad that we're here. Our tech is going to be a lot different than it is normally, so we might have some hiccups. We've got to be okay with that. Now, we're also in a different situation that we're streaming, so we have an extra layer of complexity that we're adding on to the game. But just sort of saying, maybe you won't be using Roll20, for instance. If you're playing D&D in Roll20, maybe you're used to the fact that now it kind of calculates everything for you. You're used to the idea that, oh, okay, well, we're not using miniatures. We're just on a screen, and I don't need to worry about my character sheet because it's all automated. And then you're in person and you don't have access to those tools at the same time anymore, or you don't want to use those tools. You have to give yourself permission to realize that it's going to be a little slower going the first time that you're back. You're going to have to get used to those habits again. And at the same time, you'll also recognize that there's some things that are way easier when you're in person. Interrupting somebody isn't going to be as much of an issue. You'll have the visual cues and the energy that they are presenting to them, to the room, that will make it much, much, much easier for you to play without sort of stepping on each other, which is often common when you're dealing with telecommunication software, partially because you miss a lot of those nuances, but also because they introduce lag. And lag is an issue. Even if it's just, 100 milliseconds worth of lag is going to be enough that you won't quite catch it. You will start stepping on each other. You will start interrupting each other when you shouldn't necessarily be doing that. So that's a thing to keep in mind, to work on going forward. So that's the first thing that I'd say. The second is that if you do not feel safe, be honest about it. I live in Quebec. Quebec was and specifically Montreal. Montreal was one of the epicenters of the pandemic, specifically because we have snowbirds. So snowbirds are people who live in Montreal. During the winter, Montreal can be a brutally cold city. Not just because of the temperature drops that we experience, but also because it's a humid city. We live quite close to water. We're surrounded by it. It's a lake, or not a lake. It's a river. What am I saying? We're an island. So it's not a dry cold. It's a very wet cold. And wet colds can bite. It sort of is endemic. And a lot of people who are elderly maintain a home elsewhere where it's warm, and they would go to where it's warm, and then they'd come back, and they went down right when the pandemic was starting to get started in the United States, and they pulled it back into Montreal. And we also had a couple of other things. Our nursing home situations were quite poor in terms of being able to isolate the disease. And we were very, very hard hit. And we had a lot of situations where there were people who were like, oh, well, maybe we could do this. It's not really against the rules, is it? Except it totally was, because we had things, mask mandates, but we also had things like limiting the number of people who could visit a private residence, limiting the number of people who could visit a private residence even if you stayed outside. Curfews. We had curfews where we had to be home by 8 o'clock in the evening. You weren't allowed out afterwards unless it was like very specifically to walk your dog within a 1 kilometer radius of your home. And all of that was what was stuff to try to bring us down. Now our city is doing much, much better. But we still had a few people who were like, hey, so we want to get together. I had work colleagues who would meet up even though they weren't supposed to. I had friends, not close friends, but friends who would try to organize meetings and say, well, yeah, we can come into our house. No one's going to know. And I avoided all of them. I avoided them for a couple of reasons. The first is that I had family members who I was taking care of and who my partner was taking care of who were at higher risk, and so therefore just did not want to risk passing it on to them. And also because I felt like a certain ethical responsibility. So what I would say, though, is I turned them down, and sometimes that was difficult. Sometimes, and there were some social consequence of like, well, I mean, everybody else is doing it. Why aren't you? But if you don't feel safe attending a role-playing session for any reason, but especially because of a pandemic, don't go or leave. If you realize that, you know, you're there and you thought that everybody was fully vaccinated, and then somebody comes in and they start talking about how taking, you know, horse steroids can cure COVID, and so therefore they don't need a vaccination or whatever, just leave. Just go. It's not worth it. The game is not worth your health. It absolutely is not. And better that you do that and then cause a little bit of a ruckus among your player group than to just put up with it. Don't put up with things. You're better than that. You, very specifically, NFL, you are better than that. Requiem Lost has a question. Here's a question. How would you approach a player that makes every action, be it combat, social, or other, into a small monologue? I appreciate flavorful descriptions and whatnot, but come on, we only have 3 or so hours. I would tell them. I would say, hey, you know what? Your descriptions are really cool, but they're kind of long and we have to keep things going. Now, I say this, but I know, once again, using your word hole is really tough because you can come across as looking critical. In which case, some things that you can try, if you can't address the issue directly, is you can try being rude for the sake of being good. If somebody is talking a small monologue all the time, you can start sort of being like, all right, well, I want to encourage everybody to get hype about this particular combat, or I want to encourage a fast talking courtroom scene or whatever. And you can introduce a timer. You can be like, you can put it down. You can say, all right, all of our actions have to be done in 45 minutes. Let's go. Click. And then you keep that timer up on the table. Everyone can see it. And then you'll find that players will start to police themselves. Somebody who starts making grand gestures or whatnot, people will be like, we don't have a lot of time. We got to keep going. That's a cheap trick that I used twice. I used them in LARP play, and they were surprisingly effective, specifically because I had players who one was because they talked a lot and they monopolized the table. It wasn't necessarily like monologuing for flavor. They just had to talk out all of their decisions. Another one who just refused to make decisions and was like, well, I want to know what's going on. So when it came to be their turn, they would ask everybody again what was happening, where they were in that situation, put forward ideas for tactics. It was just a nightmare. So I put a timer in to just be like, okay, well, you got to keep things moving because when this timer finishes, something bad is going to happen. And bad, I don't know if that's necessarily a great option in all games. In fact, I'd wager to say that that's a very specific situation that you can pull out. But another thing that I would do if you can't necessarily address it directly is you can address the group. You can say like, hey, so I've noticed that sometimes we are getting a little bogged down in descriptions and we kind of have to keep moving a little bit. So, just keep it in mind that a short but really cool description is better than a long description because it keeps things moving. You don't isolate a player directly, but you mention it. Now, this won't work if it's very obvious who you're talking to. If it's very, very obvious that you're talking to one particular person, you should address them directly because people don't like feeling called out in front of everyone else for no reason. But oftentimes, if you're in a group where this is happening, more than one person could stand to hear it. So you can kind of encourage everybody to follow a rule, even if you know that you're really kind of talking to one or two people. As long as it's plausible that everybody should be listening to it, you should be all right. But this is absolutely a problem. Except that because the reality is that long text is often not as good as short text in any context. If I'm reading an academic paper and it's 25,000 words long, but I could get the exact same information from a paper that was 3,000 words long, I know which one I'd rather read. It's the same with role-playing. Describing a super cool motion, a super cool action that someone's doing, be it in combat or not, yeah, I'll give somebody an extra 20 seconds to do it if it's really fucking cool, but 20 seconds to say my character's going to put on his hat and his coat and his gloves, and then he's going to open the door and he's going to step out into the rainy streets. And he looks up at the sky, at the moon, and wonders, why do you cast your light down when it's barely enough to illuminate the case that I have before? And then I cross the street to go to the bar so that I can get another drink, to get loaded, to figure, like, I could have just said, I'm going to go across the street to the bar to get drunk because my character is upset. And one of those situations is appropriate at any time. And one of those situations is appropriate when you can be consistently entertaining and everyone at the table wants to give you that license. Everyone loves Cliff Notes for a reason. Yeah, to a certain degree. So it's okay to mention it. It's one of the examples that I've run into on Disconcordia. We have a rule, it's in our player's guide, which is that you can't write too much in one post. And the reason being, because then no one can interrupt you. It's unfair to sit there and write out, 3 paragraphs worth of text and then press enter, because what you're saying then is nobody has a chance to rebut any of your arguments. Everybody has to read all of the words that you've written. And also you have to make everybody wait for you to finish writing it. And it sucks in a lot of ways, but players aren't doing it because they're assholes. They're doing it because maybe they're used to forum role playing where it's a little bit easier to get away with something like that. Or maybe it's because they really took the time to think about what they were going to say and they wrote it in advance and they want to make sure that it all gets out there. Or maybe they just don't think, but we just tell them. It's a skill. It's a skill that you will get better at the more that you try to do it, of telling somebody something in a non-judgmental way. But if you just keep actually opening your mouth and using it, it gets easier. And as it gets easier, you'll find it much the same with the safety cards, right? Like, train yourself to be able to say, hey, so just a thing, this is something that I'm thinking of. I have had great success recently with people coming to me and saying, hey, I'm trying, but I just want to point out you did something recently and it doesn't make me feel great. And I want to make sure that I let you know. And it's not that I was doing it on purpose to make them feel badly. It's not that I had, it wasn't even that like it was necessarily something that would be considered socially bad anyway. But I'm like, oh, hey, you had the courage to come up to me and tell me, I'd rather you not do this because it makes me feel bad. Then I'll fucking change my way. But especially because you told me. And the fact that I've had people actually come up to me and tell me these things is phenomenal. Hell, every player on Disc Concordia, we asked for feedback. We've been slow at getting the feedback back to players. That's on us, and we apologize. But part of it is that we wanted to make sure that everyone got feedback at the same time, and we had a lot of players ask for it. And we also have a lot of work that we put into that game already. So sometimes it's really tough for us to say, okay, well, do I write feedback here, or do I run a scene that a player really wants to have? Do I write feedback, or do I answer these 8 questions that are sitting waiting for an answer for adjudication from a storyteller? Or do I write this feedback, or do I go to bed? So we're trying. We're trying to make sure that we're almost done. We have a communal document, and we're almost finished getting all of that ready. But we welcome the feedback from players. We want to hear. And if players have a problem, we want to hear what that problem is. We can't always do anything about it. We may not always agree, but we definitely always want to hear. So there's that. Get into the habit of telling people when there's an issue, and you'll find that it'll be a bit easier. Yeah, I was surprised too, Ellie, but the thing is that feedback is kind of important, and I would want to give players feedback, because if somebody asks me, I want to be able to tell them, and I want to be able to tell them something useful, because truth be told, we are in constant contact, constant communication with storytellers, and we make observations. We notice when players do certain things, and we discuss why do we think they're doing certain things. And sometimes it's an easy question to ask, and sometimes it isn't. So we specifically, because we talk about these sorts of things, we wanted to make sure that players had the option of hearing what we had to say, because that's also important. So that's part of why we decided to do it, because it just feels fair. If we're going to be discussing stuff about you, then you should have the right to know what those things are. And if it's short, you have to word it really well. Absolutely. I could say, like, you are a good player, period. And some people are going to take that as like, oh, that's fantastic. I just got told I was a good player. I'm on cloud 9 for the rest of the day. And someone else will be like, I'm a good player, but not a great player. What? And even if I say like, hey, I could give a piece of feedback right now to somebody. If I see something during character creation and I'm like, I think I know why you're making this choice, and I don't think that it's in the service of the game, it's not necessarily going to be useful for me to say, I don't want to let you have this because I think it's going to make the game worse, because that's not necessarily a reason that players are thinking about, right? So you have to find a way to position it so that they can kind of understand that they can use it a little bit better. Because we want to make sure that people know, which is why we've kind of divided our feedback in like what we love and what we suggest, because what we suggest doesn't necessarily mean you've been doing something wrong. It's, hey, so we've noticed something and we'd like to suggest that you keep this in mind going forward. Maybe you're the perfect player and we'd love you to death, but that doesn't mean we're not going to try to make sure that there's at least one thing that we can suggest to everybody going forward. We also have to, be careful of people's feelings. Somebody who legitimately, we feel like there's a definite hole that we feel in like your role-playing skill that we want you to fill. Like, people don't want to hear it that way. Because we also don't know you as players. We don't know you personally. So we don't know what's going on, right? It could be something as simple as, well, here's the thing. Maybe somebody has an issue spelling. Well, it could be that the person is using a really bad keyboard and just doesn't care that they're typoing all over the place. It could be that the person doesn't speak English as a first language and just isn't as used to the language. It could be that the person is dyslexic. It could be that the person has a learning disability. It could be any number of reasons. But I can say that if you don't make an effort to type, if you don't make an effort to spell properly, it makes your posts harder to read. And if your posts are harder to read, it makes us less likely to want to read them. So, like, that's a thing. There's so many different reasons why this could be the case. Maybe, and one of the reasons might be, oh, I just never realized that it made a difference. because I mostly just talk to my friends on my phone, and I just text, and on text, I don't have to worry about any of these things. But in here I didn't realize, no problem, right? Like, so it's tough to choose what kind of feedback you want to give. Because it's just spelling, right? Like, yeah, it's a suggestion that we can give you, but like, it's just spelling. It's not that big a deal. And we don't want anybody to look at the feedback and be like, oh, he hates me. Oh, they hate me so much because they bothered to bring this up. No, absolutely not. Feedback is hard. Criticism is hard. You get yourself a fine arts degree and you will take university classes, which they call something else, like design for the theater. And what it really is just how to give and receive criticism for a full class. And not even a 101 class. This is a more advanced level class instead. So yeah, we've been trying to be careful about the feedback that we're giving, but we want to make sure that people get it. But of course, if you have a specific question, you can throw it in your private forum at any time. You can just contact a storyteller whenever you want, and we'll answer that specific question probably faster because we can. But being vague is tough. So we try to not be vague. Any other questions that we have coming out there? I just keep descending into talk about the various games that I'm running. And for people who aren't in these games, it may not be as interesting for them. But then again, if there's no other questions, ask away, because hell, I'm here and you might as well. Man, I think it's because I just haven't been drinking like refrigerated water. And this is refrigerated water, and whew, gotta like it when it's cold. Of course, I've also got it in a vacuum sealed thermos, so it's just staying cold, which is perfect. Perfect for me anyway. Yeah. Plus we want feedback because we suck. I mean, for most of us, this is kind of like a first major storytelling experience. And even for me, I got holes in my play all the time. I'd like to fix them. I ain't perfect. Far from it. So feedback's good. And if I want feedback, then you should have the right to feedback too. That's only fair. Well, it doesn't look like we're getting a whole lot of other questions in, which is fine. Maybe there are questions to be had. So I'm going to start the wrap up now, even though we're a bit early, and we'll see where this is going to go. I'll point out that if you are interested in watching us play role-playing games, that's on Sundays on this channel, 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time currently, although we will be moving to Eastern Standard Time within a couple of weeks, so that'll be fun. We also have other streams throughout the week, but coming up specifically tomorrow will be a Punch Effect. That's on twitch.tv/Elizabeth A. Neal, where Liz and Scott will be running through more of Mass Effect 2. On Saturday, Drew Crew, which will be at 3 o'clock, where they read from Nancy Drew Mysteries. That's what we have to come up as well. Okay. Oh, here we go. Ellie Spot says, or asks, are you happy with the number of... Hey, come on. Show up. What the hell? Get on the screen. I asked for your question here. Where is it? Featured chat. All right, well, featured chat is busted, but I'll read it out anyway. Are you happy with the number of players now, or are you considering doing more recruitment? Bluntly, we kind of always have to recruit because you will always lose players. Players come and go. Sometimes somebody gets a job and then they're fantastic, like they're really thrilled, but it means they can play less. That's going to happen to a couple of people now, and it will happen to more people going forward because as the pandemic lifts, there will be more work, I imagine. Then there's also the question of somebody who just gets bored, or somebody who gets other priorities that they come in on the way. You on Monday? Yeah, that makes sense. So, you know, and I'm not saying that if you have work, then that means, well, you can't play anymore. It just means that maybe you won't be around as often. So we always want to see more players, but I am happy with the number of players that we have at the moment, considering that we want to make sure that the ratio of players to storytellers stays relatively low. and we're not currently planning on adding storytellers at this time. So yeah, if you have people who you think would be interested in playing, we'd love to see them. We'd love to get that chance, but we're not necessarily going to rely on it. We're not openly advertising for more, because if we had more players than we have now, we would have to have additional storytelling staff. And at the moment, that's not what we're interested in. We're very happy that the game seems to be popular and that a lot of people are playing. There seems to be action during most hours, at least when we're awake. We recognize that we're not awake at all times. So we're glad about that. And we can definitely take on a bunch more players without it being an issue, but we're not looking to actively recruit. So we'll mention it on our streams. If you mention it to your friends, that's absolutely fine. If you mention it in other places, that's great. If people want to follow you on over here. But we're not planning on doing any massive wide recruitment at this point. I can't casually stay up until 5 a.m. just because it's really intense. Yeah, that's a thing. I can't either. But what I can say is that at least people seem to be very good about setting those boundaries. If there's people who aren't good at setting those boundaries, it's actually storytellers. We'll often be like, I want to go eat dinner, but I'm in a scene. But every single time that we've been like, hey, I got to go, no one's complained. So we should just learn, learn how awesome our player base is. And we can figure out that we don't have to, we don't have to suffer as a result. But yeah, no, obviously don't stay up until 5 a.m. And then go into work the next day at 6. Just don't do that. The games are fun, but the game is fun. I don't know how long the game is going to last. So that's another thing that I suppose I can just touch on. We don't currently have an end date planned for this. We did at one point have the idea that we would use seasons in much the same way that we've been doing with our streams on Sundays, and kind of say like, okay, well, we've had the first season, and then we can decide what we're going to do for the second season or whether we're going to stop. I'm not sure that we never really figured that out. If we get to the point where the game starts becoming a struggle to run, then we'll figure out a solution from there. If we get to the point where there are not enough players to kind of keep the server active properly, then we may sunset it. And if we decide at one point that we don't want to do it anymore, then we'll figure something out. Maybe we'll pass the server on to people who are willing to take it on. But at the moment, we're kind of happy with the situation that we have now. We do not want to add more storytellers. We've had not a lot, but we've had a few offers for people to be like, I would like to play NPCs, or I would like to play as a storyteller. And we really appreciate those things, but at the moment we just don't want to get into that. Players who want to play NPCs are often doing it out of the kindness of their hearts, and we really appreciate that. A lot of LARPs do this, where players can like volunteer to play as NPCs in exchange for favors, experience, maybe a reduced cost of entry, that sort of thing. But we don't charge anybody. But if we add storytellers to it, part of it is that, it's just more coordination at that point. The more storytellers we add, the less I can roleplay, as I think another way to put it. I already sometimes struggle with getting enough time to actually be in the server and roleplay, but also deal with all the backend stuff as well. Because the backend stuff sort of has to take priority in a lot of ways. Because if you let that stuff stack up, then, eventually your players just hate you. But if I had to start coordinating like 10 storytellers all together, then, that means that certain storytellers just will be only doing admin. And at that point, I'm fine with that, but then I want to get paid because I don't want to, that's not as fun for me. So one of the things that the storytellers have all agreed on, and I think that's something that all the players can agree on as well, is that if this stops being fun for us and we can't reverse course and make it fun for us, we'll stop. Not because we don't want to do it, but because if it's not fun, it's just not worth it. If it's a job, I have a job and that job actually puts food on my table. So I don't like, as long as I'm having fun, then I don't have to worry about getting paid. Yeah, but there are chores involved, right? And one of the things that I'll say that our player base is also really good at is that we haven't received any complaints yet when we've had to say things along the lines of, no, we can't run that because we don't want to. Doesn't happen a lot, but for instance, scenes that involve a lot of combat, rolled out combat, are draining on the storyteller. They're draining on everybody. They're not easy, but for a storyteller specifically, it sucks. And like Kate, for instance, has been doing a bunch of that recently, and like we're happy to do it, but if we had to do it every day, I'd throw my computer out a window because a short combat that you can resolve in 45 minutes, 45 minutes also isn't short, but a combat that takes 45 minutes at a table can take 4 hours in text easily. And then sometimes you'll have players who just will be like, all right, well then I got into combat. That was great. I want to get into more combat. And you're like, but we just spent 4 hours on combat and I don't want to do combat anymore. So our players are really good about not kind of pestering us to do a lot of that all the time. It has to be a sometimes food. Most of the fun that comes from an online Discord game like this kind of has to come from the players themselves. Because if you rely too much on the storytellers bringing that fun to you, one day the storyteller won't be there. And then there's no fun to be had for anyone. So that's something that we really do appreciate, that we're not getting a lot of requests and complaints when we say if we can't fulfill them. Although we do pretty well. We accept most requests. We allow them to go through. But yeah, there comes a time where you're just like, I don't think so. For instance, today we have to come up with house rules for House Leonon in Disconcordia, because House Leonon have a boon that is ridiculously overpowered for a social game and a flaw that will never apply. So, that means we got to rewrite the rules if somebody wants to play Leonon, or we have to say you can't play Leonon. And that takes time. All of that takes time. So, but it's time we like to do, because we're finding it really gratifying and people are having a lot of fun, and that's great for us. At any rate, thanks for tuning in. I'll stick around for another couple of moments to see if there's any other questions or comments. But otherwise, it looks good. Requiem mentioning that most of the game thus far has been more social or political than combat heavy, and it's more challenging. Well, yeah, but that's by design. We could just attack the freehold every 2 days with creatures looking to like fuck shit up, but then we'd get burnt out real fast, and we wouldn't want to do that. Most online games that are text-based like this kind of have to be social in nature if they're still adhering to rules that apply to tabletop. There are other games that can handle combat quite well, but those games tend to be freeform, where there is no storyteller and you just decide what happens, and that's the way it is. So not a lot of dice rolling there. More complaints and whining, but fewer complaints. But anyway, thanks for tuning in. Very appreciated. Again, tomorrow, Punch Effect. That's over at twitch.tv/Elizabeth A. Neal at 6 p.m. Saturday, Drew Crew at 3. There will not be, I think, a Doomed or Attuned stream on Saturday, because I believe that Scott is occupied in the evening. But then Sunday, Exalt Twitch Academy episode 15? Are we up to 15? Or are we only up to 14? No, we're up to 14. So we'll have to do that then. All right. Thanks a lot. And remember, it's hard. It is hard. But the more you do it, the more you keep going over it, the more you try, the easier it'll be to use your word hole. See you next time.